We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this session on the common workflows. My name is Scott Caravan, and I'll be presenting part 3 of our workflow series. Today, we're going to be focusing on branching and builds. If you haven't had a chance to see part 1 or part 2, and you might be interested in some of the other workflows, there will be a follow-up email that will come out after this where you will get this presentation and a link to the video. That will also include the links to the videos for part 1 and part 2. So if you're interested, you'll be able to get those as well. So let's go ahead and get started. For this set of workflows, just to kind of set the scope, when we think about software development and then securing that, the typical software development lifecycle will include, making new adjustments to code or building new code. And then often we'll store that code in some sort of Git repository. And at different times when we feel that code's ready, we can go ahead and integrate it and deploy it using CI/CD pipelines, and then, deploy it to production. Inside of this normal development workflow, we might want to be able to scan code for vulnerabilities at different times, whether that's sort of during development, the IDEs, using a command line to be able to do that, or while we're pushing code to the repository and doing PR checks, or if we're just actually looking at the repo and kind of monitoring it on a daily basis or doing builds. So these are different points during the development lifecycle where it may make sense to integrate Snyk and have it do security scans at all of those points. And for each one of these, there are some different workflows that can occur, and that's been the topic of our sessions. So inside of part 1, we really looked at the IDE and some of the workflows related to that. And in the second session, in part 2, we looked at how to do different workflows around PR checks and doing ignores of some things so that the vulnerabilities are known, but aren't going to break things as far as the repository scans and stuff like that. So today we're going to finish and we're going to talk about this last integration point and how to do scans during builds. But before we get to that point, one thing that we talked about as we went through the other workflows is we kind of assumed there was just one branch of code. And that's probably not a realistic kind of thought. A lot of times there will be multiple branches of code. And from a security standpoint, we would always want to monitor and be able to scan the production branch that's been deployed. But developers will often be working and they'll want to be able to go ahead and do scans on a different branch. There may be multiple developers working on some sort of feature branch, and we'd like to be able to scan those branches as well. So we're going to talk about both some of the way this would be impacted and how we can turn on branching inside of Snyk to be able to make that possible. And then we're also going to talk about doing scans inside of the build process. And hopefully I'll be able to get through this relatively quickly and save a little time for questions, so that if you have questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat at the moment. And then when we get to the end, we'll try to address as many of those questions as possible. So if we start thinking about branching and scanning branches with Snyk inside of the software development lifecycle, the workflow could be as simple as let's just test and monitor the main branch. So as a developer, we'd want to scan that and be told when any issues are found before they could get to production for that main branch. So I'd like to know about those as soon as possible. So we could actually merge our code. And as we're merging our code, if we're using a CI/CD tool and it's going to production, it could go grab that main branch and we could run a scan on that. And then if anything was found, the developer could be notified of any problems, and that report could then tell us how to fix things. And we could determine whether we wanted to fix those immediately and go back and work on things, or if we want to go ahead and decide to ignore some of those are things that we can do. So we've kind of talked about those types of workflows before and kind of how these pieces work together. So when we think about this from a Snyk perspective, being able to scan that master branch and being able to monitor it and trace it throughout the whole life cycle would also include us kind of importing it. So at some point, we'd have to initially scan it and have traces of how that actually works. So inside of Snyk, you can go into the user interface and ask it to add a new repository at any given time. And at the bottom of that dialog box, you will actually see something called the settings for import. So when we're working on importing some code, by default, it will import the default branch. And for some repositories, that's the main branch. For some others, it could be the master branch. But it does allow us to go ahead and specify specific files that we want added to the scan. And we can also exclude some folders. So when we're doing an initial import of a branch, whether it's the main or the master branch, whatever the default branch is, we get to choose the settings and how that's actually going to work. So what if once that branch is scanned, we're monitoring that branch and things are good, I also wish to keep track of the new feature branch, because monitoring that master branch or that main branch, that's probably where the work has been merged up to, and that's probably gone into production. So by monitoring that, I kind of have a good idea of what my vulnerabilities and issues are in production. But as the developers are working on a new branch, say a feature branch, they will be merging code up to the repository, and it would be great if we had some sort of CI/CD process that could, look at that and then say, okay, for this branch, notify us of the different vulnerabilities so that we can decide, yes, we're going to fix certain things, or no, we're going to go ahead and break that. So one of the things that you can do inside of Snyk is turn on this beta feature, which is monitoring branches. So if you turn on that beta feature and you go to add the exact same repo that we had previously added, by default, we would have, again, brought in that main or master branch. But now when the beta feature for branching is turned on, it won't be just the default. It could be some other branch. So this monitor branch optional field at the bottom allows us to, if we know another branch name, to go ahead and choose that branch. So maybe as a developer, I'm working on a feature branch and we're calling it the feature dynamic branch or something like that. I could enter that here. And when I enter that in, then Snyk can show me, and we had been using an example in some of our previous workflows of a simple Java project that is some goof code that I kind of put together. And here you can see that the first scan was the master branch. And then I went back in and added that feature or dynamic branch. And then there was an older branch that I wanted to go back and scan to see what the differences between these two branches were, to make sure that my new feature branch had fixed some of the key vulnerabilities that I was trying to get rid of. So you can actually begin monitoring multiple branches and seeing the differences in between those branches. So when we think about branching and what we want to scan, we can either make these scans, just, import it into the Snyk tool. It'll keep track of these on a daily or weekly scanning basis. And then we can also add those to our pipelines. So when we looked at those particular workflows, we were also kind of talking about how different branches may be monitored at different points in those pipelines. Usually the production will get monitored and go through one of those pipelines right before it gets deployed to production. Maybe these feature branches would go to testing. But the nice thing is, by integrating those and making sure that those scans can be brought back to the user interface in Snyk, we can see the different branches and how they're related from a security standpoint as to the number of issues that are actually out there. So this branching feature is a beta feature, so it is relatively new, and it is something that, sometimes, depending on your branching approach and your strategy, some groups will have 2 or 3 main branches that everybody is working on with the production branch, and then 2 or 3 feature branches. There are some very dynamic branching strategies out there where every little piece of code and every little difference is in its own feature branch, and maybe then all those feature branches merge back to a dev branch or something like that. So one of the things to consider when you're using branching in Snyk is that here I am scanning 3 different branches. And for this repository, it's actually adding up all of these. So if I went to the reporting page, my Java Goof repository is reporting this number of vulnerabilities. And because it's reporting that number of vulnerabilities, you can see it's the summation. So by scanning these other branches, I've now added 2 more sets of probably the same type of vulnerabilities that may be in the master branch. So it can be a little bit, it can impact your reporting a little bit because you would be duplicating some of these vulnerabilities. Some people ask me the question, why has master got so many more vulnerabilities? The master branch also has the container that it's deployed in. So the container has some Linux vulnerabilities and things like that that get scanned into that branch as well. So, but that's just something to think about. Some teams will actually like to scan their production branches in one set of projects in a different Snyk organization, and then have their dev branches scanned somewhere different so that they can keep the total number of production vulnerability and reporting separate from the others. In Snyk, our new reporting capabilities are pretty awesome. There are lots of ways to filter and manage all of these projects. So typically I just leave the branches that I'm working with inside so that I can always see all the branches of the repo in one place at the same time and kind of see some of those relationships that might be there. So that's a little bit about, how to take advantage of this beta branching feature. Once you've done the imports and gotten those branches in, you're able to see them inside of Snyk and kind of work with those as you're going along. So that takes care of the branching piece. I did mention that, some of those branches we may wish to scan at different times, and we could be doing that in a CI/CD pipeline. So in those pipelines, we would be building the code at different times. So where could I scan these builds? How could I use different types of pipelines? Inside of the first set of examples that I was using, I'd like to try to show 2 different approaches. I did mention all of the Jenkins scans. So if Jenkins happens to be your CI/CD tool of choice, Jenkins is great. Snyk integrates with that really, really well. I also occasionally use Circle CI. So I like using this for some of my other types of scans. So just in general, to be able to get Snyk to automatically integrate with a pipeline from one of these tools, we can either use plugins to that tool itself, or we can set up integrations to be able to do that. So in this case, I have logged into Circle CI and I've asked Circle CI to authorize the connection between my Circle CI and my GitHub. And then I'm going to incorporate a Snyk scan so that when it sees that the code has changed and it tries to build that code in Circle CI, I'm going to let Circle CI know that part of the build process should actually be a Snyk scan. So the way I do that is once I've set up this kind of relationship, I can go into Circle CI and it can tell me that in my repo, I have a bunch of these projects, and I could select Java Goof or my vulnerable app Goof that I use for different types of examples. I can pick one of these, and then that becomes something that when things have changed, it will immediately begin looking at building this into a new kind of executable that might be able to go to whether it's test or production, wherever it might be sending this. So for Circle CI has a config.yaml file, and that config.yaml file is the kind of configuration of how it is going to do the build. And then once it's done the build, I can include a run section that we can just name, and the name doesn't really matter, but if I call it Snyk test, and then I tell it I'd like to give it some commands. One of the things we mentioned in the first part of our workflow series is that we can not only do scans in the IDE, but we can do scans on the command line. So here you see 2 commands that are actually commands for the Snyk command line. One of them is Snyk auth to actually authenticate so that we're able to go through the code and it knows who we are so that we're allowed to go ahead and do a scan. And then I could run a Snyk test, or I can run a Snyk monitor. Snyk test will give me the results back. Snyk monitor will do all the work and then also capture a snapshot in the database. So we can add these types of commands, and they can be fairly complex commands that are part of the build process. So here's a fairly complex one where I'm actually doing a Snyk test, getting the results in JSON, and then using a modifier to our tool that takes that JSON and turns it into an HTML file and saves it for me so that I could review that as a kind of report for what happened inside of this build. So if I've set my config.yaml up right and I've integrated GitHub with my Circle CI, then when I go to make a change to my code, if I'm merging new code into the repository or I make changes in different ways, then Circle CI can actually see that when something new is changed and it's monitoring those branches, that it can begin attempting a build. And when it attempts the build, it can begin building the code itself. And then when the YAML has that Snyk test inside of it, because we had asked it to do that Snyk scan, it will begin following those commands. And when it begins following those commands, it can tell us what's actually happened. So it's easy for us to go inside of these jobs and open up the jobs. And one of the things that you'll see is because this Snyk command that I gave it was just a command that we can typically run, and it's the normal type of thing that we might be doing in a command line scan. You can see that the scan ran and it returned a set of issues. And it returns the exact same set of information that we would expect from the command line scan, which includes, here are the different vulnerabilities, whether they're high or critical. It can tell us where they got introduced. And for some of the issues where we actually know that there is a fix, and we'll be able to kind of see how or which of the different versions, future versions that might be available that might fix this vulnerability, that would be available to us here as well. So usually the way this will work is that, when we go in and we try to submit new code, the Circle CI build agent will grab that, begin doing the build, and then we'll be able to see the results here in Circle CI. So depending on how you like to go through your workflows and where you're going to see some of this build information, whether it be in a Jenkins pipeline or a Circle CI pipeline like this, you can see it kind of after the code has been submitted. And certainly, we're very developer focused at Snyk. So part of the previous workflows were us talking about, how you could have scanned that in your IDE first, how you could have, even checked the PR check before you merged the code. So, as I started this off and we talked about the basic workflows, all those different integration points are places where Snyk can give you feedback about how things are going in that part of the software development lifecycle. So this kind of gets us to that last one where if once the code's in the repo and we ask it to be built, we can still get the feedback, and it doesn't have to be feedback just from a Snyk perspective. We don't have to go to the Snyk UI. We could see this inside of the Jenkins console. We can see this inside of Circle CI. And that way we can get more reports and more information inside of the build systems and the things that we do today. So that gets us to the point where I'm going to go ahead and take questions in 1 second. One thing I wanted to do is just kind of show a little bit more of a live demo. Here I am inside of Snyk, and here I had mentioned that, if we kind of add the right set of branches inside of Java Goof, we can see each one of the different branches. And when you open these branches, you're able to see the resources. Different branches may actually have different resources inside of them. So for the master branch, I mentioned that my Docker resources are also here. So not only do I have my open source POM XML files and I have my code, but I have the Docker files. So here in my old branch, Java 9, I've got the code and I've got my open source, but I don't have some of those other resources. So each of the branches could actually be different, depending on how that branch or when that branch was built. It may have a different set of resources, but when you come into your projects and you find your repo, if you've had multiple branches, you can go ahead and see those. And being able to get a new one is as easy as just adding projects again. And if I go back, here are the different repos that I have. And if I asked for Java Goof again, down here, I could type in another feature branch like patch 2 and ask it to add that one as well. And if I did that, it would take a little while to do that scan, but that would add yet another branch. And that's, again, where we want to be a little careful. We may not want too many branches out there being scanned by Snyk at the same time because of the duplicate issues and things like that. When I was mentioning as part of the projects and some of the other things that we were looking at, let me go over to the reports and go back to the branch. There we go. When we're looking at these, if we're going to have these be part of the build process, then usually inside the repo itself, we'll see things like that circle CI's config.yaml file. So, you know, from the two things that we were talking about inside of the Snyk UI here, you can see the branching stuff. You won't necessarily see the information about the builds because the builds will be in a config file in the repo. So Snyk inside of our UI shows the results of the scan, doesn't actually show the contents of the repo. So if I wanted to see exactly, you know, more of the details of what was in my config.yaml, it would make sense for me to kind of open one of these projects. And then once the project is open, in the upper left, you can always kind of jump out to GitHub and see the Java Goof code. And then I could, you know, kind of look for the configuration files and other things. So we'll go back to the slides and kind of open it up for questions. Maddie, do we have any questions from the chat?
Yes, Brett is asking, how does he turn on branch support for his organizations?
So that's a great question. At the moment, the beta feature is something that is a request. So that beta feature, we don't want people just accidentally turning it on because it could impact, you know, the overall number of scans and things like that. But you can either open a support ticket, or if you're interacting with some of our customer success teams, you could ask someone from the customer success team to turn on the beta feature of branching. And that custom branching feature can be turned on relatively quickly, usually after you make the request. It takes them, you know, less than a day. It should take them just a little while for them to be able to turn it on and then let you know that it's there. You'll know that it's properly turned on when you see that monitor branch during the import process. It will be there. Once that feature is turned on, you don't have to import things through the UI. You can also use the API and get to branches in many other ways as well. Okay. Good question.
Okay, so we have another question. I'll try to phrase this. Monitoring these monorepo branches, are all the languages supported for Snyk Monitor, for example, requirements.txt, config.yaml, build.sbt?
Yes. So the question there is, if I have a fairly big monorepo and it has multiple types of code inside of it, Snyk open source has a set of languages that are supported, and Snyk code has another set of languages that are supported, and a lot of those are the same languages, but they're not exactly the same. So sometimes Snyk open source supports a language that Snyk code doesn't, and sometimes Snyk code supports some things that, you know, the open source doesn't. But if you go into Snyk and you find that, you know, here's the list of open source languages, or here's the list of code languages, if it's in the monorepo, then it would be seen and scanned. So it should be able to find the differences if you are, you know, using requirements.text files, and then you also, you know, have some Java code somewhere with a POM XML. It should be able to detect all of those and scan them in there for you.
And everyone, as you're submitting your questions, please submit them to everyone and in question format so we can decipher those a little bit easier. So we do have one question that monitor branches is currently a beta feature. Is there an ETA for official feature release? And I know we usually don't provide dates, but I'll let Scott clarify that.
No, that's a good point, Maddie. So I know that the good news is that this branching beta feature has been in beta for a little while. I don't have an exact date, but I know that, you know, part of the roadmap and things are to have that available sometime later this year. So that will be available. Part of the reason it is still a beta feature is, we're just testing the performance and other things to make sure that, if you do monitor like 10 branches, how is Snyk going to handle that well and be able to do all those pieces. But if I had to guess, sometime later this year, you'll see this. Once it does go from beta to an actual feature, there may still be a toggle where you'll have to say, yes, I do want to, have multiple branches scanned, because by default, we'll only scan the default branch, and we'll probably limit it to that just so that, by accident, we don't end up scanning a whole bunch of branches. But yeah, as Maddie was saying, I don't know the exact date, and I'm not sure if we'd end up sharing that anyway, but it should be hopefully sometime later this year.
Caitlin is asking, she's saying our branch scans don't seem to scan the Docker file we expect. How does Snyk decide what to scan and what not to scan? And she's looking at her dashboard.
Okay, so sorry, Maddie, in the beginning of that question, it said that one of the branches, it didn't seem to see the Docker file, or?
Yes, our branch scans don't seem to scan the Docker file expected. How does Snyk decide what to scan and what not to scan? Caitlin, if you can, some clarification might be needed in the chat. So if she's, does that make sense, or is clarification needed?
So in general, when Snyk is scanning a branch, it shouldn't matter which branch it is, and it should scan the branches the same way. So if you're seeing a Docker file being scanned in one branch, and that is an active part of the other branch, it probably should be getting scanned there as well. So that may be something strange or a bug, but
maybe a support ticket.
Yeah, I was going to say Snyk doesn't change the way it does the scan in any of the branches in any way. It's the same scan for all those places.
Okay, and I don't see new ones coming in, so we have about 1 minute left. So I'll ask. Okay, I see a bunch just came in. Is there any additional impact to license count when monitoring multiple branches for a single repo?
Yep. So good question. Snyk's perspective on licensing and that usually focuses on the number of developers that are actively being covered. So when a developer is someone who, has access to Snyk, they can use the IDE, they can, scan in all these different parts of the software development lifecycle. So we don't actually change the licensing for being able to scan multiple branches, because we're still just helping that developer try to be secure and write good code. So no differences in the licensing.
Okay, so Caitlin's original question of some branch scans don't seem to scan the Docker file. Her teammate Jake has clarified that they've seen challenges before when there's multiple Docker files or Gradle files, for example, on their team, and sometimes they have difficulty specifying that they want to scan both.
Gotcha. So there are some places, and for some things like Gradle and certain types of things for containers, where if you're scanning a container and it has a Docker file associated with it, that if you just run an import from the UI in Snyk, Snyk will import all of those files, but it won't necessarily be able to tie them together. Where there are ways to configure things, especially if you run a command line scan, where you can actually tell it, hey, this Docker file goes with this container image. These Gradle configurations are the way I want my dependencies to be scanned. And that can actually get you a more accurate scan. So sometimes, depending on the type of resource you're scanning, if you did a CLI scan and then pushed the results using monitor or reporting up to the user interface, you might see better results because it's not just doing a default scan. When we do a generic import, we don't always necessarily give the Snyk scanner all the information that we know, like, this is the way the containers are built with the Docker file, this is the way Gradle works. So sometimes doing that extra CLI scan, and you can do the CLI scans on branches. So doing the scans that way may give you more accurate results.
Okay, Jake said they have had better luck with the CLI as part of the CI/CD, so an API is a good suggestion.
Yep.
Okay, I know we're 2 minutes over, so the last question, Scott, if you have time for it, is
sure.
from Kevin. How does one manage the auto PRs since they're often for the wrong branch, parentheses master, when they're working on staging?
So good question. If you have auto PRs turned on, and that's auto pull requests where Snyk will find certain vulnerabilities and it will automatically try to create the pull request that would fix that vulnerability. So that's something that we do for open source because we can find a particular version of a package and we'll try to find another version that will fix that quickly. So we'll open that PR. Auto fix PRs, when being used with branching, can be unpredictable. So this is one of the reasons the branching is still in beta. And that is that auto PRs, once they find a new vulnerability, aren't sure which branch it should belong to, or if it should belong to all of the branches. So that is still one area where I think when we get the production version of branching, we'll see a little bit different behavior, but that is kind of a known oddity that if auto PRs are turned on, depending on which branch has been worked on last and where it goes, sometimes that's where the auto PR shows up. So not totally unexpected. I know it's not the best behavior, but that's something that should improve and get better when we get to the production version, the GA version.
Okay, so I know we're 3 minutes over, so I think we can wrap it up now.
Yeah, if we see other questions, I can try to answer some back in email or something like that. Happy to do that as well.
Yep. But otherwise, everything will be sent to your email address, this recording, links to resources. So thank you all for joining today.
Thank you. Have a great day.